just have to say you accept that you're being in a recorded Zoom. So welcome everyone to Roundabout Books Tuesday Virtual Author Series. My name is Julie and I am the events manager at the store. So before we get started with tonight's event, I just wanted to remind everyone to check our event calendar online or on our Facebook page to find out about upcoming events and book clubs. We have several local author events, including the second edition of Bend, Oregon Daycations coming out. And in about a month, on March 15th, we are hosting Lilium Rivera for her book, We Light Up the Sky. So as some of you might know, we are expanding and renovating the store. So I just want to make sure you are checking our website for days that we might be closed. For example, we were closed today because they're tearing down a wall. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom. I just want to remind everyone to stay muted while the authors are speaking. Occasionally, if you unmute, the video will also go to you, and that can be, disrupting. But please feel free to have your video on so we can see you, you can see us. And then towards the end, we will have a Q&A session, and I will be putting some information in the chat about books that are being mentioned tonight, as well as some podcasts. And then I just wanted to remind you that this event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, which also has recordings of all of our events since May 2020. That feels like such a long time ago. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome two Pacific Northwest authors. In October, I was lucky enough to attend PNBA with both authors just days before the last Cuentista published. Now, this book and Donna have won the Newbery Award for Children's Literature and the Pua Belpre Award. Starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Shelf Awareness call the last Cuentista gripping, euphonious, I might actually have to look up that word, and full of storytelling magic. And Donna Barba Higuera deftly blends Mexican folklore with science fiction in this thrilling and emotional post-apocalyptic novel, pardon me. Joining us tonight is also Portland author Roseanne Perry, whose book, A Wolf Called Wander, was nominated for an Oregon Book Award and has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over 2 years. So please welcome Donna and Roseanne to have a discussion about the last Cuentista. So I turn it over to you, Roseanne and Donna, to get started.
Hi.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you all, and your kitties and pets and so forth. I'm so happy to be here with Donna. We had the opportunity to be together at the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association in the fall and hear about this book for the first time. And I was really delighted by what you had to say then, Donna, and I'm so excited for the voice that you bring to the group of Newberries, or old berries, as I believe former winners.
Yeah, it's the centurion years.
So I think the people who have been the Newbery winner now call themselves the old berries, or at least,
Ah, okay.
But it's such a great honor. It was initially intended to correct the oversight of leaving children's literature out of the Pulitzer Prize. So it is intended by the Library Association to have the same weight as the Pulitzer Prize in fiction.
I did not know that.
I know, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
There you go. You're like even cooler than those Pulitzer Prize winners.
I am taking notes to tell my children later. I am even cooler now.
And also do the dishes. So yeah, I'm thrilled to have the voice of a Westerner in that position, and yeah, I'm excited and so thrilled for you. Shall we begin talking about the cover? Can we do that?
Sure. What a great place to start with this beautiful cover. Yeah, it's
close.
Yeah, the illustrator, her name is Raxen Manakis, and she is from the Philippines. and she's a fabric designer, and just the coolest thing ever. She's never done a book cover.
No.
Yeah, she teaches, I believe, graphic design at a local college where she lives, but she does fabric design and like creates jewelry and I think things like that. And she had an Instagram account, and my editor, Nick Thomas, has a way of sniffing out people who have never done illustrations and saying, hey, you want to try this? He did the same thing with Lupe Wong Won't Dance, which this cover, again, I love this cover. And the gentleman who did this lives in the UK, and he designed album covers for records and did some like kind of stuff with sports and basketball. And then after he did this, he got picked up by Nike, and we'll probably never see him again. So, and Raxen, I know she's getting a ton of attention because this book cover is just absolutely beautiful. But this was actually the first cover she turned in was this, which is, it refers to, isn't that beautiful? It refers, yeah. And the opening scene, the grandmother is saying goodbye to Petra, and she's telling her a story about the fire snake. And that is so humbling when you're a writer. I'm sure you feel this way too. When somebody creates art based on a story you've made up or written, and there are all these little Easter eggs and details, and you're like, oh my gosh, they actually read my story.
Attention, hey.
Yeah, it's really humbling, and to have somebody create something so beautiful, and a lot of pressure, because this is, my daughter said, Mom, your book could be really crappy and people will still buy it because the cover is so beautiful. So vote of confidence from my daughter, but it's true. This book is so beautiful.
It is, and I love how there are all these little details. Like there's that little rabbit in the corner. I'm trying to.
Yeah, El Conejo. He's kind of a trickster guy, but I'm like, oh my gosh, she got him there.
And there he is again on the front flap, and then on the back flap, I think this is which direction am I going? The necklace right here. The necklace.
I've never seen it. Oh my gosh, I just got goosebumps. How did I miss that? I never saw. I just thought, oh, it's a star. I need to get my eyes checked, and I'm an eye doctor. That does not bode well for me. I did not see the necklace. Oh, goosebumps.
And I love the cactuses. I lived just for a year at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which is kind of by Sierra Vista, which is clear the heck down by Nogales, Mexico. And so I remember all of the cactuses, and I came there directly from working in the rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula. So I thought it was going to dry up and blow away. But I loved all of I love all the cactuses in the corner there, and the cactus flowers, and the desert was just much more, the desert was more interesting than Roadrunner cartoons led me to believe.
Absolutely. Yeah. I grew up in Central California, which is very deserty, but it's more sagebrush or tumbleweeds. And there are lots of cacti, but they don't really have the beautiful flowers like you see in Arizona and other places. So I wanted a little, to show. My mother always said we're in the middle of the oil fields, and it was just dusty and dirty. And my mom always would say, every place has its own kind of beauty. And so always try to see the positive in it. And for this, I'm like, I think I can make her, her surroundings just a little bit more magical.
Right. Yes. Prove it, Mom. Is what my teenage self would have said. Really? Is it beautiful here? So this is a question that I actually don't get very often, but I was thinking of when I was reading your book, is this could have easily been a book for adults, even though the main character is a child. It doesn't disqualify it from being a book for adults. So why write for a young audience?
Okay, I have strange feelings. I don't know if everybody feels this way. first of all, I think even I've tried writing young adult fiction. I
Mhm.
just feel really comfortable writing middle grade fiction. And I think it's because in my life, those are probably where I have emotions and feelings I still need to digest. So a part of writing is really cathartic. It's therapy for writers. And so these books, and I never know until I'm done. And I look at them just like the necklace. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was writing that because I had this unresolved issue from my childhood. And or it can be something going on now, but I just feel more comfortable writing in middle grade. But I also feel that once I can't help but impart feelings and things that I feel currently, maybe what's going on in the world, which is why sometimes people say, oh, there are adult themes or things so I don't necessarily know that my books are just specifically for kids, because every time I write a book, I have so many adults reading them as well. And I also think specifically with the last Cuentista, somebody who's reading it who's 10 years old is going to get something entirely different from it out of somebody who's 15 and someone who's 20 and someone who's 50. So I don't think it's a book that's just a one specific age group type book, but I don't know if I intended it or not. I really did feel when I was writing it that I was writing it for children, because it is absolutely, I know this is becoming a bit cliche, but it's absolutely the kind of book that I would have devoured when I was a young girl, and it would have scared me. It would have made me cry. Like there are things about it where my gosh, I would, there's certain ages where I wouldn't have been mature enough for this book. And so I think each child is different too. And so when people ask me, well, what age group is this for? I'm like, well, it depends on the kid, because, there are different levels of, what people can handle emotionally. And I was a really sensitive child, but I feel safe in middle grade. I think that sometimes when you venture into, I don't know, kids are brutally honest, but they don't judge. And so, and I think sometimes it's the opposite with adults. So I think I'm going to just hunker down in middle grade because I feel safe here. And kids will tell me, they'll say, well, I don't like that, or I don't like that. And I can handle that. But sometimes the brutality of what happens I like where I am.
Yes. Ursula Le Guin once said, I remember somebody asked her, why was it that poets were so mean to each other? And I love this answer. It's so typically her. She said, the smaller the territory, the more frequently the creature needs to spray. And I thought, oh, that's so true. And I have thought of it often since. I'm like, oh, look, here on Twitter is an example of literary leg lifting. We'll just let that pop.
Okay, that needs to be the new hashtag, literary leg lifting.
Exactly. So anyways, but yeah, I mean, what I really love about middle grade is that it's children are very curious about the wide world, right? Young adults are quite inward in their thinking because they really do need to sort of figure out who they are and launch themselves out into the world, right? But I love how cyclical middle grade stories are. You usually start from a home place of some kind and go out in that big world and have an adventure. And there is almost always a homecoming of some kind. And I love that very much, that there's just that little taste of a homecoming at the end for your character.
Yeah. And I can't remember what happened. I know we made some edits. Oh, we did get to keep it. I wanted the last word of this book to be home.
Oh, nice.
Because of where it began. And we changed the ending several times, but I really fought for that last word. And I mean, obviously it also has the ending, all Mexican folklore has a beginning and ending and kind of a little entrance. Welcome to my story. And now you may depart when it's over. But I wanted to show that, where it started, where she was home and then she lost that and then she found it again. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I love that about middle grade readers. And I also love that they're honest, but they don't care if you have an MFA. Do you know, like they're not interested in the pedigree of the thing.
Mhm.
They're just interested in a good story.
They want,
And
and that's what I'm so glad you brought this up, because people ask all the time about writing. And especially when I'm doing classroom visits, kids ask about that. And I say, okay, teachers, cover your ears, because I talk about grammar and writing skill and those things. And I tell kids, those are not the most important things. The most important thing is being a storyteller. And if you can weave a story that someone is sitting in there engrossed in and they're listening to,
mhm.
then you can learn writing. Anybody, and I don't mean to make it sound, but I was not a writer. I always thought of myself as a storyteller. I do not have an MFA. I've taken classes here and there, but most of my writing skill is self-taught. I've read tons of books on the craft, but
Me too.
I've been in a critique group for
Mhm.
over 10 years. And I think that is part of my learning process. And
Mhm.
so everybody learns differently, but I think that we don't want to put so much emphasis on, grammar and, where is going to be the split for this paragraph? What are we going to ultimately,
Mhm.
if we can share stories with one another and maybe pull in a friend or a fellow writer or reader into our story and share something about ourselves that
Mhm.
either maybe we were nervous to share or uncomfortable to share, and maybe they'll do the same. And just, it's such a part of human growth. And I think that's what stories can do for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't a writer at all when I was younger either. I hated writing in school because I'm super bad at spelling, right? Thank God I studied another language when I was in middle school because I can spell just fine in German. Thank you. Very logical, orderly, rectangular language. But I was so bad at spelling that I didn't like writing at all. But I did discover, and it was around those middle grade years when I started babysitting, I discovered the power of being able to capture those little eyes and those little, minds and imaginations with a good story, right?
Yeah.
And that it had power to dispel their fears, right? When they were, their parents were gone and they were trying to fall asleep, and continually seeing that, as a teacher, if I told my kids a list of 10 facts about the American Civil War and then asked them the next day, they'd be lucky to remember two, right? But if I told them a story
Yeah,
about it, they would remember that story years later, decades later,
absolutely. Yeah.
right?
My
And so
daughter.
that power of story was
Yeah.
what I really loved, right? And the spelling, not
Yeah,
my
not so
favorite.
important. Yeah. When my daughter was little, she wanted a story every night. And so sometimes we would read, but most of the time I would tell her a totally made up story. And I made up this imaginary world. Oh, and when she would lose her teeth, oh, I don't know why I did this, but I started a pen pal relationship with a fairy Gwendolyn. And then she started writing back to Gwendolyn. And so every tooth she lost for years and years. And 1/4 of her room was a Gwendolyn fairy house. And it was always a mess. And she just lived in this world. And then every night when we should go to bed, I would tell her a story about, this girl named Sophia, which is her name, who would disappear through the little, plug-in in the wall, and she'd go through the tiny hole and go into a fairy world. And every night they would have a different rainbow party. And, they would have, if it was the red night, they had to wear red dresses and they ate strawberries and had punch. And so every night I would make up this big ordeal. Well, now she's turning 18 and she wants to get a tattoo of a fairy because she's like, you're the one who did this. So she's blaming me.
Thank you.
Blaming me for this.
I did such a similar thing with my kids and the Tooth Fairy. And it was because I have 4 kids and, that's a lot. And it was a little distracting. And so my child lost her tooth and she was late to lose her teeth. So she was like, I'm too old for the Tooth Fairy. But then she put it under her pillow anyways. And I forgot about it for a week. And then she was like, see, the fairy doesn't exist. And so I made up a little Tooth Fairy, and instead of giving them money, I gave them foreign coins.
Oh, cool. Okay.
to explain why it had taken him so long to get there.
That is good parenting. And that is very, you just maneuvered the story around. I'm impressed.
I'm going to remake this little thing. And so then, yeah, we had many little conversations with this very crabby Cedric Brown Fairy, who was quite upset with the bureaucracy of the Tooth Fairy Institute. And anyways, it was fun. It was.
That is so funny to me that, yeah, we both had these imaginary tooth fairy worlds, and
yeah,
it's
like you do, because it matters to them. And
it does. And yeah, those stories are, and I realized my father did the same thing. And especially, in Mexican culture and Latino culture, there's a lot of, there's an emphasis on the oral storytelling. And so, for instance, when my grandmother would tell stories, my grandmother went to school until she was 10 years old. And so she wasn't educated, but she could weave a story. And a lot of it was while she was cooking or while she was cleaning, and something could happen. And she would just like, oh, mija, let me tell you this story. And she would like go make up this complete story about things. And so the word cuentista, it means storyteller, but there's a little bit of a connotation to the word, because there's also a word narradora, but which means storyteller. But cuentista means that whoever's telling you the story, you don't quite know if they're trustworthy or not. They might be spinning things just a little bit. And so, which was important to me, because I wanted to show that both, Petra and her grandmother, they changed the stories to suit what's going on, but also it's a little bit manipulative. They do it to try to, in Petra's case, she's trying to convince the other children of something, or even to give them comfort, but she changes the story just slightly to suit her needs. And I think that's what, sometimes as storytellers, they're not white lies. They're just,
and things lost in translation too. My husband was in the service when we were very first married. And so we spent a couple of years in Germany, and because my grandfather was born in Germany, we spoke a little bit of German when he moved in with us when I was a teenager. And I had also taken German in school. So I read the Grimm's fairy tales in German, and it was so fascinating to me because they're so much more nationalistic than they are in the American translations of them. And so it was really interesting. It was fascinating. And as I'm reading through, I'm like, oh, look, I believe we are mocking the French. And now I see a little dig at Russia here, and all of these things that just completely flatten out in the American translation, because those biases are not our biases, really. And so yeah, it was interesting to take these fairy tales that they're the fairy tales everybody knows. Red Riding Hood is Red Riding Hood, right? Well, it's not really the same.
In Latino folklore, and again, like Grimm's fairies tale as well, a lot of them are far creepier than the versions that are diluted for, American children. And a lot of times in Latino folklore, it doesn't follow the same story structure that a lot of American stories follow. So I've spoken to friends, just someone recently, I was chatting, or yesterday, we were talking about how her story, it's a great story, but because it doesn't really follow what we think of as in American culture, she's having a hard time getting it published in America. It will be published in other countries, but in America, it's something that someone goes, what? That makes no sense. And so, but a lot of times those stories don't necessarily have to make sense.
Did you have a question there?
Yeah, I actually, just because this is kind of what you're talking about, Donna, right in the beginning, when they're about to board the ship and she's trying to reassure her brother, she scares him. And I wonder if that is, unintentionally, but, him being raised maybe more with American versions of them, when she thinks that she's saying, no, it's okay, our ancestors are all watching over us, all those stars are them, he's like, there's dead people? What? Like, she scares him.
Yeah, it's really fun. And if you talk to, it's tricky because like I'm mixed race. And so hearing it's, there's code switching that goes on between being one thing and also being another. And especially in certain cultures, there's a lot of magical realism and things that are not scary in one culture, but in another you go, oh, okay, well, I'm going over to this side of the family, so I can't say that to them or I'll scare them. And in this case, she's saying something to her younger brother that she actually, she probably has heard from her grandmother, or she's trying out her skills. I think it was when she was trying out, and she's talking about, the ancestors are with us, they're watching us. And he's, he's younger and is like, wait a minute, they're ghosts, they're dead people, so there is a little bit of that gets lost from one culture to another. And these are kids who are navigating both cultures. And so, yeah, she thinks she's doing a good job, but it doesn't work out for her.
Well, is there also a sense too, because she spent more time with the grandmother? And I did want to ask you why she doesn't call her like abuela. She calls her Lita, which I assume is her name.
So there are a lot of different sort of nicknames for grandmother. So Lita is just like because a lot of times abuela, a lot of people say abuelita.
Okay.
And so Lita is just kind of her nickname for that. Some people say abue. There's so many different names for grandma, kind of like ours, like, whatever, Mima or what. We've got lots of different names. Same thing in Mexican culture. And I can't speak to all Latin American or Latino culture, but I know that there are lots of different nicknames for grandmas and grandpas. And I called my grandmother different names depending on, where we were and who we were with.
Yeah. Now, my thought though, too, is if Petra spends more time with her, because I know that her and her brother have a good amount of an age difference.
Yep.
But I have a cousin who's almost 11 years younger than me. And then she moved when she was fairly young. So the stories I know from our grandparents, she doesn't know any of them.
Yeah, this is so funny that you said this, because when I was young, I stayed with my grandmother a lot. My parents were they were young parents, and then they were going to graduate school. And so my sister and I would stay with my grandmother quite often for weeks and weeks on end. And so I spent a lot of time with her. And a lot of time, I loved chores, working around the house and getting eggs. And they had a farm. My grandfather worked in the oil fields, and they had pigs and chickens and everything else. So it was a very rustic life, a tiny little tilted house. But I loved it. But I spent so much time with my grandmother that I feel like I got parts of her that my cousins didn't, and even my older sister. And there were things that, I spoke more Spanish with my grandmother than even my sister did. And then of course my grandfather would come home, and then instantly it was like English only. Cause I grew up in the 70s, and it was, you have to assimilate, and it was just a different time. I mean, it's one that people want people to be, go, oh, that's so bad or whatever. It was just a different time, and people were doing the best with what they knew. They were afraid, and is what it is.
Yeah. Similar story in my family too. My grandfather, when he emigrated, they came to a point that he forbade his sisters to speak German in the house. And, for the same reason, he was afraid he couldn't protect them. It was the beginning of the First World War, and he was a teenager raising his sisters, and he was terrified. And so he was like, nope. He burned all the letters from home and said you can never write those people again. And I don't think he burned the books because they were too precious to him, but he stopped listening to Bach and Beethoven. Like, so sad.
Yeah.
Because he didn't know, if he wasn't, maybe if he had been older, or if he had older people in his family, I don't know, but he was terrified, and he was just trying to survive. And so I wish that he had kept his language and culture alive for my mother, but he was not having it. And he was like, we're here now, and this is it. So I think
there's so many of those stories, I think every person, if you go far enough, everybody has one of those stories, an immigration story or something where they felt they had to change to be more of something. And most of the times it was out of fear. It was out of fear of, you know, how others would treat us. So
Yeah. Yep. I agree. There's somebody who raised their hand like they had a question. Is there how did you want to manage the question situation?
Think so. I think someone did have to hop off real quick.
Oh,
So she had
okay.
just put a note in the chat saying thank you.
Oh, Ellen.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And then, yeah, so we have plenty of time for your questions still, Roseanne, too.
Okay. Well, since we're talking about mythology, I was just wondering if you had a favorite source for mythology to read, or I mean, there's probably a million, right?
Yeah. So I love all mythology. I just devour it. It doesn't necessarily have to be Mexican folklore.
Mhm.
But I do think that there were stories that maybe I heard when I was younger that weren't quite exact. They weren't quite the exact version. And
Mhm.
so I do have books now that I've been reading. They're actually pretty, they're pretty sparse. There's not a ton of books specifically on Mexican folklore. So I do a lot of when I'm writing and I'm like, oh, I want to write about this story. There's one story where it's Itzacihuat and Popocatépetl. And I wanted to write their stories, but there's so many different versions. And so I wrote in the story, I wrote the version that best suited my story. So I just took them and I said, this one best suits my story. So I'm using this version. But, you know, I think oftentimes what happens, especially in, you know, there so many countries have similar folklore. And when people move and they migrate to different areas, they take bits and pieces. It's like having roots in different areas, and they take bits and pieces of what they have learned or heard. And so stories change. And one, I don't think I used it, but there's a really well-known story about La Llorona, and it's the weeping woman. And there are stories from central Mexico to the Southwest, and they are all widely different about what really happened and who this poor woman was and why she went to the extremes that she did. But they all change depending on, you know, what's going on in the world. And there are some versions where the man who wronged her was a Spanish soldier. And then and that was because that was what was going on in that region, and they had to have a bad guy. So it's all just depends on, you know, where these stories have traveled, and they change as they're going along. But I wrote an article for Tor magazine, and they were talking about Mexican folklore and science fiction. And it was really interesting because when I did a lot of research, there really weren't any books. There were no Mexican sci-fi books. I really had a hard time. There are now, people are starting to write them. But there really wasn't a lot of Mexican folklore either. I found some children's books, and there were some written in the 60s and 70s, but.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, I mean, I suspect my family is also Irish. And so like, I suspect for Spanish folklore, a lot of it sort of got transformed into Christian tradition along the way.
Well, yeah, but also there are some stories where if you look at, you know, the Popocatépetl and Itzacihuat, I need to look at when that story came about, because it is straight up Romeo and Juliet. And I'm like, okay, did one borrow from the other or vice versa? Like, how are these stories so similar? But we see that too with a lot of ancient folklore, like, you know, the flood myths. They're all over the world in different cultures. And so I think that a lot of times we want to believe that we are the only ones who have these, you know, these tales and stories, but many of them have migrated all over the world.
Yeah, or they have arisen because a certain circumstance has arisen, right? Like floods apparently happen regularly across the earth. And so there's that need for that flood narrative because it's so devastating. I mean, the power of water oh my God,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
terrifying, right? And how can we live knowing that that little creek behind my house that looks so pacific and calm and ordinary could rise up and kill me at any moment, right? Like I remember when we were also stationed in Texas for a year, and they had these arroyos that didn't have a bridge or anything. You just drove down into the ditch and up and out. And these were on the Army base. And the Army base said, proceed with extreme caution. And then they had the number of people who had died crossing the water that way. It was like, it changed while we were there. And I was like, whoa, yikes. Well, because they have people from coming all over the world, all over the country, right? And who have no experience of an arroyo. So it looks like a dry ditch,
Mhm.
but it
What a deterrent.
I
Oh,
know.
why would
I
want
was
to
like, I'm not driving at all. Thank you.
Exactly.
I'm turning right around. So, but the thing was, stop, roll down your window, listen, look all around and see if there's a cloud anywhere. And then reflect on whether you should really cross the road, right?
Yeah.
And so how can you live knowing that that kind of destruction is right there? It's right there all the time, right? Well, you have to have some kind of story.
Well, I think that
Yeah.
in a lot of times, if you go through your life and think, I do this all the time, like the what ifs, like what if this happened? What if that happened? We would be petrified to ever go anywhere because we could create these scenarios. And when I was a little kid, that I did that all the time. So I remember having a really vivid imagination as a child. And like I said, I didn't necessarily write everything down, but I would make up stories in my mind. And they almost always, before apocalyptic was a word to a little kid, they were apocalyptic to me. And they were always really scary. And it was always a worst case scenario. My poor parents, I was always afraid to go to sleep. And
yes, all that catastrophizing. I remember, in fact, it was my very first writing experience. I was looking at the outlet in my wall when I must have been maybe 5. And it looked like a little door and 2 windows. And because there were 2 on top of each other, I thought, oh, a tiny apartment house. Clearly, small creatures live within the walls of my house. I will write them a letter. So I scribbled a little something on a little scrap of paper and I rolled it up tiny, and then I pushed it through the window. And then I sat waiting for them to reply. And then after a few minutes, a little curl of smoke came out of the outlet. So I went running to my mother. Mom, the people in the walls hate me. They burned my letter. She was like, oh, stop. But right, immediately this was a catastrophe because, they were in fact malign creatures who were living in the wall of my house. And
they were lighting your notes on fire.
But yeah, that tendency to catastrophize, you got to have something to grip onto.
Yeah.
So anyways, well, I could talk to you forever and ever about this, but we've got about 15 minutes left. Shall we give people a chance to chime in with their questions?
Sure.
So Kathleen had actually already emailed me a question. So first, and it's something that I've been asking some of our guests recently, but do you have a musical playlist while you're writing, Donna, specifically?
Well, I don't have a specific list. I can't listen to anything that has words. It's really distracting for me. My latest thing, I've been listening, it's called Piano Sunday, and it's called Studying or something. And it's like something studying. Oh, I should look it up. I'm afraid to lose you if I look it up, but it's this man who creates all these different piano Sundays. That can be from movies. It can be from this. And there's one, I want to say it's like study time or something like that. And I've been listening to that lately, and I have it on a loop. And that's what I've been writing my latest book to. But it's strange because, I can't have words, but I love just very like low background music. It helps like kind of set the mood. And and I light incense. I do the whole bit.
I Mine right now is Beatles instrumental, but I will say that depending on what I'm working on, if I still need a little bit of energy, it's all Lin-Manuel Miranda all the time.
Oh,
He can do no wrong. And then what is an outstanding science fiction book for you? And her question was, were some of them that Ben mentioned any of them when he's playing them?
oh, yeah. I had to do shout outs to, Bradbury and Le Guin. And I will say I always go back to it. I guess I don't know if it was considered sci-fi, but like when I first read The Wizard of Earthsea, it was like, I always go back. I need to go reread it again and figure out like why it was so profound to me. But there were certain books that were that way. And a lot of Ray Bradbury's short stories I read. And I think, and it wasn't just books. I grew up with, Twilight Zone and Star Trek, the original series, and The Next Generation, but nothing more than that. And then I'm a true nerd, but there are certain things that just really affected me. And I think that certain stories, you can't help but somehow they permeate into your work, and you have to watch out for it because you go, oh my gosh, I'm actually like pulling that in, and you have to kind of take a step back from it. But I love reading just short sci-fi stories because I love when things are left with a little bit of a question, and then the reader gets to make stuff up. Like you get to take it a step further. So those are probably my faves. And I know that I'll think of something else later that I'm like, oh, I should have said that. But
I'm a huge Wizard of Earthsea fan too.
And you taught it. It's a class that I took with you. Yeah, we read University. And I like Ray Bradbury. Obviously, I love Fahrenheit 451, but one of the Illustrated Man short stories from high school still sticks with me.
I just got goosebumps. What is it going to be?
So it's the one with it's the lions on the savannah, but it's like the kids go into it and then bad things happen there. But it's also just the Illustrated Man with everything on his back. Like there were just different ones. Because I've always told people, I'm like, I don't really like science fiction fantasy, but then I realized that I do. Yeah. See, I think someone just put it in the chat, the Velt. And it has stuck with me since I was like 16 years old. So I have put links to both Donna's book and 2 of Roseanne's book and A Wizard of Earthsea in the chat. And I'm going to put them in our Facebook event too, if anyone wants to check. But I know that Joanna, one of our new booksellers, had her hand raised to ask a question. So go ahead and unmute yourself and you can talk with us.
Hello.
Hi.
This is not my question, but I used to be a high school teacher, and I actually used Wizard of Earthsea in my curriculum because my theme for the year I worked with 10th graders was mythology. And I think for a fantasy mythology, it's an excellent example. So,
and I think too, what a great age to share that story, because also the main character goes from, the lowest of the low as a kid to becoming, having so much power. And that's an age where that's what kids daydream about, is just, when will I have a little bit more say? Like, when will I be a little bit more of a grown up? So what a great book to choose for that age. It was powerful.
Yeah, I taught the hero's journey, and those kids were, getting their driver's licenses for the first time. It really was that time where they were leaving their ordinary world and going into another world and learning what they had to offer and what they had to bring back. And it was a really neat.
I just got so excited. I'm a huge hero's journey person. I apply it to all my stories.
Oh, cool.
And my secret boyfriend, who now he knows because my husband, who's also a writer, met him and told him.
Yes.
So the writer's journey, Christopher Vogler, which fangirl, it says, to Donna, my super fan. Trust the path, Christopher Vogler. Oh, Chris Vogler. We're on a very casual,
very intimate basis at this point.
yes. Yeah. So when I read a lot of books on craft, but when I read the hero's journey and the writer's journey, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. This helps me, because I was being so structural. But when you apply this to a character's path, it just blows story and storytelling up. I just love it. And I know that some people are like, oh, well, that's one way of telling a story. Yes, I know there's lots of ways of telling story. But for me, if you can get into your character's mind and give them the hero's journey, I just think that it's a way for the character to grow. You can't miss, but it's not the be all end all. I get that, but I love it.
Yeah, especially for children, I think.
Right.
Okay, so my question, sorry.
Oh, I got too excited, sorry.
I actually have two questions for you. One is, the Newbery to me is such an important award, and I wanted to hear from you what it meant to you to win it. And I also wanted to ask you, I'm from the Seattle area originally and lived there for most of my life. And I'm curious if the Pacific Northwest has made its way into your writing in any way.
So the first question, what did winning the Newbery mean? First of all, I was completely dumbstruck. Like I had no clue. It came out of nowhere. And I think, as a lot of people know, Newberys typically they don't choose books that have a sci-fi or dystopian type theme, not often. And so I was completely shocked. But then it still hasn't entirely sunk in, but when I sit and think about it and what it means, I go back to that place where I was a kid, and you would walk into your school library and you would see you'd see the Newbery books and the gold sticker. I'm from the era of, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So I'm like, oh, it's the golden ticket. There's something extra special about that book. There's something magical. And so for me, there's a kid who's going to walk into a library and see my book and read my words, and and maybe it will it be impactful to them in some way. Maybe it won't. But even if there's one kid who's like, that was a cool book, then my job here is done. And so about the Pacific Northwest, it always finds its way into my books in one way or the other. And Lupe Wong Won't Dance, it's set, I live in Issaquah, and the book is set in Issaquah, and it becomes a huge part of the setting. The walls in the school are algae covered, like her surroundings, like the whole thing, just the misty Pacific Northwest. So yeah, I mean, the Pacific Northwest is very magical, and there's so many, just the green of it and just all the water, it makes its way in. The book I'm writing right now is a dystopian that was once the Seattle area, and it doesn't resemble that anymore. And it's super weird and sad to me, but I have to do it. So it always makes its way in. I love where I live. I love the community. And, but it always finds, I try to sometimes go, I need a new setting, and somehow it makes its way in, even if it's no longer lush and green, it's still the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, it does. I think that most writers, we can't help but it can be somewhere in your house, it can be wherever, but those settings find their way into your work for sure.
Yeah.
So Kathleen has another question. Kathleen, do you want to unmute and ask it?
Hi. Yeah, it's actually a question for both authors tonight, but I want to say I'm not finished with the book yet, but I felt I really feel a lot of emotions already in the pit of my stomach, and I just want to say thank you for, it's like visual is always happening as I'm reading this book. It's wonderful. Thank you. So I do the middle grade book group at the shop, and this is our next book. So just so you know, Roseanne. And I don't know if any of them showed up. I totally encouraged them. But here's my question for both of you. I know you love children to read your books, but how can they communicate that to you? Do you take letters? Do you write back? Do you do emails? I always tell kids that writers are real people. And if you write to them, there's a big chance they may write back. And I just think that's really important. So I just wanted to know if that has happened with you. Have you written back to kids and all that good stuff?
I do. I write letters. I think I love when you're a kid, if you get something in the mail, how cool is that? And so I handwrite out a letter, and my family's horrified because my new thing is I want to put a wax stamp on everything. And so I keep almost lighting my office on fire to put wax stamps, but I'm having so much fun. And so, yeah, and even if it's just a quick note, I try to answer questions. Sometimes there are lots of questions. And so I just answer the best I can. And there can get a stack, but if I just do a couple a day and drop it, how much does that cost to toss it in the mail and send a kid a message? And it's like when you got something, somebody brought the mail, if there was actually something with your name on it, just amazing. That just never happened. And so I just think it's such a gift you could give a child. Emails they're still great, and emailing a class is great, but I think a piece of mail is awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love a piece of mail too, I think, and there's something really unique and precious about that. And on my website, I ask young people to mail me at the bookstore rather than at my house.
That's kind of what I wanted. If there's a contact, what is it?
I'm getting a P.O. box. I never had one. Someone said, you need a P.O. box. I'm like, okay.
I love
that. So a P.O. box can be a good answer to that situation. The bookstore, fortunately, they have a good sense of humor about taking my fan mail there.
Okay.
And I will say, sending it to the publisher, although it will get to me, it might be 6 months before it gets to me, because they get all the letters for everybody, and then some intern or other comes in and sorts it all out. And when they have a stack of it, but they do it like every 3 to 6 months. So if they're actually wanting an answer, taking a look at the author's website is a good way to go. I communicate on social media too, but I'm much more sporadic about that. So you can connect with an author on social media, but I think if you're a young person, you should say that you're a young person, because I can't always tell by what the person has said whether or not they are a child. So that's super helpful for me to know whether I'm talking to a 12-year-old writer or a 35-year-old writer. So, useful information.
I'm a big letter person, so
but I like the letters.
I'm in touch with you.
And I think many authors will have on their website, here's where you can, if you want to send me actual mail with a stamp, here's where to go.
So I realized we did miss a question in the chat. So Rebecca had asked Donna, how was the writing process for this book? Did it go fast or slow?
Hi, Rebecca. She's my friend. Yes. So, for this book, it actually was slow, and there was a ton of revision, and I was a little bit all over the place. A lot of times a scene would come to my mind and I would write the scene, and then my editor would say, okay, now we got to figure out how we're going to put this in. And so we did a lot of piecing things together, and because at one point he said, we need more to know more about her life before she got on the ship. So I wrote some of those scenes after the fact, and then we had to figure out the right spots to put them in. And then I had to go and rewrite things. So it was a complicated book. It really was. And the revision process was tough, but it was, in the end, I was very worried about some of how things jumped back and forth in time a little bit. But at the end, I was like, oh my gosh, I love the way it jumps back and forth in time, because you get pulled, and it's just a reminder every once in a while of what she left behind on Earth. And then you go back and you go, wow, we're here now. Wait, now we're going to go back and see it's something else that she lost. And so it's a bit of a roller coaster, but yeah, it was a hard one.
It turned out so good. So yay for
And I
that
think
struggle.
those transitions seem really seamless to me. And I think that's really hard to do, that hopping back and forth in time. I hardly ever do it because I think it's hard to do it well. But
It was hard.
Yeah.
People,
It seems very,
writing is hard.
it is work. It's actually a job.
It is. It's difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, we're almost done with our hour. If we have any more questions, please, of course, put them in the chat. I will say we had one question. Sandy's just wondering your connection to Tulum, because you mentioned it in the story, and she used to live in Cancun. So is that like a particular area that you're familiar with?
I'm familiar with it. I have been both to Tulum and Cancun, but my family was from near Baja in a town called Laredo, and so it's in a different part. But I had been to Tulum and I wanted to incorporate it because I could visualize it in my mind. And honestly, that's why I did it, because I'm like, okay, I have been there. I have been around the people and I know what it's like there. So I felt like it felt familiar, but ironically, I haven't been to Laredo. So that's why I could have chosen Laredo, but I haven't been there. So and that's one place I'm like, hey, when all this is over, I'm going to go back and, see where my family was from. And yeah, I will get there.
Well, I just want to remind everyone that we are recording this. So if you know someone who couldn't make it tonight, or you want to go back and watch something just to get the name of a book that we mentioned or anything like that, please check the Roundabout Books YouTube channel and we'll put it on our website. And then I'm going to throw up the links to the books that we talked about, including Wizard of Earthsea, into the Facebook event. So again, please purchase books if you haven't from us at Roundabout Books. If you are not local and you're not okay with shipping, please buy it from your local independent bookstore. In Portland, that could be Annie Bloom's, where Roseanne Perry works. Indie bookstores keep the rest of the indie bookstores alive, as well as all authors, because while we still have to deal with the big bad whomever, indie bookstores are going to keep the book industry alive. So I want to thank everybody for supporting Roundabout Books, for supporting Donna, Roseanne, and all of the other authors out there. We really appreciate you. And thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate. I loved the book. Roseanne, I've read several of yours. I love them. So yes. Oh, so hold on. Someone says, sorry. I'm so excited to introduce The Last Cuentista to my students, and they're listening to the audiobook of A Wolf Called Wander. So again, audiobooks are great. I actually I'm thinking about checking this out on audiobook now, just to kind of get that oral storytelling thing going at the same time. Like, yeah, I love audiobooks. I really do.
Me too.
Yes.
Me too. And speaking of audio, and Donna, because you're such a fan of Ursula Le Guin, I just wanted to say I have only just in the last week run across a podcast series from the Between the Covers podcast called Crafting with Ursula. And it's a series of interviews with people who were inspired by her work, and in some cases people who have been really good friends of hers. It's really good, and it's, it gets into the nitty gritty of how to really craft story, and I just found it super inspiring myself, because I'm like in the thick of analyzing every sentence and every single scene, because I have to turn something in at the end of the month. And so I think you would love it. And for those of you listening who are writers or teachers, might find it super valuable too.
Yeah, I'll put the link to that in the YouTube description so people can find it. So yeah, well, thank you so much for spending your Tuesday night with us, everyone. We really appreciate it. Cannot wait to hear more from both of you as authors. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really fun.
All right, everyone, have a great night and keep reading. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.